The humid air of the jungle envelops me, filling my lungs with the scent of earth and wild nature. I move slowly, trying not to make unnecessary noise, for my goal is the black jaguar, a master of camouflage and stealth. The handle of the rifle in my hands feels like an extension of my body, though my palms are covered in a thin layer of sweat. Holding my breath, I pause to look around. The sun barely penetrates through the dense canopy of trees, creating patches of light and shadow on the ground. Here, in the heart of the jungle, every sound makes me tense. Every movement in the bushes makes me turn around. But I know my target is close. Suddenly, my attention is drawn to a barely perceptible rustle to my right. I slowly turn my head, trying not to startle the beast. And there, in the shadows, I see it. Its eyes gleam in the semi-darkness, and it watches me motionlessly, as if assessing. My hand instinctively tightens around the trigger. Tension hangs between us. I know I cannot afford even a moment of hesitation. The jaguar could vanish as suddenly as it appeared. I aim, holding my breath, time slowing down, and then I press the trigger. The sound of the shot shatters the jungle silence, echoing among the trees. The animal falls, its powerful body weakening and slumping onto the damp ground. In that moment, I feel a mixture of relief and sadness. But it had to be done. This predator had been terrorizing the local village. It had already taken 5 children, and who knows how many more it could have taken. I brought the carcass back to the village and handed it over to the village elder. After making notes for my book, I bid farewell to the grateful villagers. The task was done, and I could return back home to the States. A couple of days later, I was already in my home state of Wyoming. As I approached my house, I noticed a black Ford parked opposite. When I walked up to it, a tall man in a suit and black sunglasses emerged from it. He looked like a spy from the movies. The man extended his hand and introduced himself. His name was Alex Red, and he worked for the FBI. He asked me to accompany him as the agency had a task for me. Surprised but not refusing, I left my camping gear at home and got into the car with him, heading off in an unknown direction. Soon we arrived at a small gray building. Parking beside it, we got out of the car. A serious-looking guard stood at the entrance, conducting a thorough check before allowing us to proceed. Passing through narrow corridors, we entered a small room where several other people were already present. Among them was a woman around 40, dressed modestly, and a man about 35 wearing a hat. At a table nearby sat another man, roughly my age, dressed in khaki clothing. We entered, and Alex gestured for me to take a seat. Then he approached the screen in the center of the room and began to explain why he had gathered us. "Firstly, before you, there's a contract you must sign," he said. "It states that what's said here must not be disclosed, as it's classified information. Breach of confidentiality could lead to imprisonment." I took the sheet and read it carefully. It was serious business, and as a former military man, I was familiar with such procedures. After reading it a couple of times, I signed and handed it back to the agent. My neighbors did the same. Alex took the sheets, checked the signatures, and placed them in a cabinet. Then he went to the switch and turned off the lights. Next, he turned on a projector, which displayed an image on the screen. It was a man, about 25 years old, with a beard, wearing an ordinary shirt. He stood in a room with light shining directly on his face. Nothing remarkable, except for his gaze. Squinting from the light, he looked into the camera with hatred, as if he had seen his fiercest enemy. Then Alex switched the slide, and the photo we saw shocked us. The woman sighed and leaned back, while I held my breath. Surprisingly, both men reacted calmly, with one of them just tilting his head slightly. I looked back at the screen. It was the same room, but instead of the man, there stood a creature. It was a werewolf, a real one, the kind often depicted in horror movies, suitable only for fiction. It was incredibly grotesque, resembling more of an alien than a human. Thick gray fur and an elongated muzzle with an open mouth full of large, sharp teeth. Its appearance shocked me. As an experienced hunter, I had never encountered anything like it. Alex glanced at our reactions, then stood by the screen and began to explain what it was all about. The creature you see on the screen is a real werewolf. They come in different types. There are harmless ones that quietly live in the forests, and there are those who start killing people. The werewolf you see on the screen can be classified as the latter. This type of werewolf we've named lycanthropes, as they transmit the disease lycanthropy. It's highly contagious. One bite and you're infected. Then, when the full moon rises, you transform into a monster. You lose all control and move purely on instincts, which demand only one thing from you: to kill. We listened in astonishment, as our perception of the world was undergoing a radical change. It seemed like legends were coming to life. Alex continued, "The government has been monitoring these creatures for a long time. Fortunately, they appear quite rarely. The last recorded case was 20 years ago. When such incidents occur, we hire experienced hunters and animal specialists to catch these beasts. Although it's a monster, it's also a human being, specifically a citizen of the United States. So we classify them as patients. Therefore, you must try to capture them alive. This will also help us study their disease, as after death they become ordinary humans and all signs of lycanthropy disappear. This is a very dangerous mission, so the government is willing to pay each of you $500,000 for a live captured beast." We glanced at each other. It was a substantial amount, but the risks were also significant. Alex asked, "So, are you ready to take on this job? If not, then leave this room, but you must forget what was said here." No one moved. Each of us had different reasons. Some were attracted by the money, some had purely scientific interest. As a hunter, I was intrigued by the new challenge. Could I catch this creature or not? The agent glanced at us and continued, "I see everyone agrees. Then let's start with introductions. I'll list the names and occupations of each of you. First is Jack Rivers." The man in the hat nodded his head. "Former park ranger, has encountered one of them before, although not a lycanthrope, but it was no less dangerous. Sophia Harper," the woman waved her hand amiably. "Zoologist, works at Stanford University in California, specializing in rare species. John Hawkins," the man in khaki raised his hand. "Former military, also had experience encountering a werewolf. Stanley Morrison," I raised my finger, "also a former military, now an experienced hunter. As far as we know, you've been to all continents and have hunted many dangerous animals. Since you're the most experienced in this matter, you're appointed as the senior. During this mission, this building will be your base, and we'll provide you with weapons and everything you need. Now let's finally get down to business. Our target is in the Rocky Mountains, hiding in the forest at their foothills. We don't know who the person behind the werewolf mask is, so you need to be careful. At the moment, 3 deaths have been registered in this area. All the evidence points to our client, to our horror or fortune, but all the victims died. Otherwise, this virus could have spread further. You can imagine if there were more such creatures and they started biting everyone indiscriminately. You will set out tomorrow, but first I'll show you to your rooms, and you'll have time to get to know each other better." That concluded our conversation. Alex handed us more papers to sign, outlining our fees and absolving the government of responsibility in case of our death. Then he led us along. We entered a spacious living room, greeted by the warm glow of soft lighting and a cozy atmosphere, which immediately created a sense of homely comfort. There were 4 doors in the living room, each leading to a separate bedroom, lined along the walls of the room. Without hesitation, I headed towards the furthest left door, deciding that it would be my temporary refuge. Opening the door, I found a cozy room decorated in muted tones with a soft carpet underfoot and heavy curtains on the windows, which, like guards, prevented even the slightest draft from entering. In the center of the room stood a large bed with pristine white covers, inviting me to rest after a long journey. Next to the bed was a small table with a desk lamp, creating the perfect spot for reading before sleep. Since I didn't have any belongings with me, I simply looked around and then returned to the living room, where my companions were already discussing something. As I approached, they turned to me, and we officially greeted each other. After that, Sophia asked, "We were just discussing the reasons why each of us was invited here. Jack and John had previously encountered a werewolf. Have you ever encountered them before?" "No, not once have I even heard of such a thing. I think I was chosen because of my hunting skills," I said. "I would like to hear what you know about them. It would help me learn more about their habits and prepare." My companions exchanged glances, and Jack began. "I encountered, or rather survived an encounter with one of them when I was working as a park ranger. That day we were patrolling our territory with my partner when a plane fell from the sky. They were smugglers, and the werewolf was on their plane. It was significantly different from what we were shown, both in appearance and behavior. Unlike a lycanthrope, it didn't transform into a human. I think it was some kind of mutant or an unknown species. I managed to survive that incident, but unfortunately, my partner didn't." We nodded silently, understanding that every time a person encounters such creatures, there are casualties. Sophia continued, "I've never personally encountered werewolves, but after my colleagues' trip to Japan, their behavior changed dramatically. They returned completely different people and avoided talking about their experiences there. After persistent questioning, one of them finally shared the secret. They encountered werewolves. At first I was skeptical about their story, but then, delving into the study of this topic, I found plenty of confirmations of such encounters on the internet. This prompted me to create a database and start studying the folklore of various cultures. From America to Asia, I found mentions of werewolves, which only strengthened my belief in the reality of these creatures. My research continued until one day an FBI agent called me, and now I'm here. I silently listened to their stories, which were fascinating. John continued, "In the deserts of Syria, I encountered one of them. We were transporting cargo, inside of which, as it turned out, was one of these creatures. Unfortunately, it managed to break free, resulting in many casualties. This creature was noticeably different from what we were shown today." As he finished his story, we began to ponder the information we had received. It turned out that there are many varieties of werewolves, and we were about to encounter the most dangerous of them. At that moment, Alex entered the living room, holding a folder in his hands. He approached me and handed it to me, noting that the folder contained all the information about werewolves that they had been able to gather up to that day. Studying the provided information, we discovered the following. People bitten by werewolves experience a desire to relocate to less populated areas, likely influenced by instinct. This may serve as a defensive measure, as they are more quickly recognized and eliminated in densely populated areas. The infected transform into werewolves at midnight during a full moon, meaning they transform once a month. Unlike common myths where the werewolf returns to human form at dawn, werewolves maintain their beastly form for 3 days. During this period, they can use it for hunting and infecting others. It was also described that werewolves possess significant physical strength and agility, making hunting them particularly dangerous. Their main vulnerability is silver, which can kill them. However, a special silver-based drug has been developed that can weaken werewolves without killing them. After discussing the new information, we dispersed to our rooms, ready to set out at dawn the next day. A minute before the alarm was supposed to go off, I was already up. Years of hunting practice had taught me to wake up at strictly appointed times. Getting up, I washed my face, and then headed to the kitchen to make coffee. Sophia was already there, engrossed in reading documents from the folder. While I spread jam on toast, she asked, "How dangerous do you think our mission will be?" "Any hunt for large game involves risks," I replied, chewing on a piece of toast. "But considering you don't have physical training, it would be better for you to coordinate our group without participating directly in the hunt. Maybe I should at least learn the basics? Could you teach me?" she suggested hopefully. Perhaps, if there's time," I reluctantly agreed. Sophia smiled happily, set the folder aside, and poured herself some coffee. It wasn't long before the other members of our team woke up as well. Shortly after we finished our morning discussion, Alex entered the kitchen. His appearance immediately caught our attention, as his expression and determined gaze heralded the beginning of serious preparation. "It's time for you to see the armory," he said, gesturing for us to follow him. We followed Alex through the narrow corridors of the building until we reached a massive door. With ease, he unlocked it and led us inside, where we were greeted by a sight worthy of admiration. The walls of the armory were adorned with a wide variety of weapons, and equipment for hunters was neatly arranged on shelves. The arsenal included both modern firearms and more exotic weapons designed specifically for combating unusual adversaries such as werewolves. Alex began to explain the purpose of each item, emphasizing the features that might be useful in our mission. He showed us lightweight but sturdy jackets and vests capable of withstanding bites and scratches, as well as various devices for night vision and tracking. We marveled at the presented equipment, assessing each item. Alex allowed us to try on and select the necessary gear, paying particular attention to selecting weapons that would best suit each of us based on our skills and experience. "These are tranquilizer bullets, specifically designed to immobilize werewolves without killing them," he explained, pointing to the bullets wrapped in blue shells. "And these are silver bullets. They can kill such creatures. Use them only as a last resort if you find yourself in mortal danger. As I mentioned earlier, it is crucial for us to capture them alive." After changing into expeditionary clothing, we stepped outside, where our transport awaited us, a sturdy off-road vehicle. Looking around, I noticed that our group looked like seasoned hunters, which shouldn't raise any suspicions from outsiders. Leaving the hustle and bustle of the city behind, we headed towards the remote corners of the Rocky Mountains. Traveling in the off-road vehicle allowed us to traverse diverse landscapes, from green meadows strewn with flowers to dense forests. As we approached the mountains, the landscape became increasingly grandiose. Tall peaks, covered with snow even in the warmest time of the year, loomed before us, creating the impression of unconquered giants. The road wound its way among hills and valleys, offering us magnificent views. We crossed small rivers and streams, their crystal-clear water reflecting the sky. The air here was clean and fresh, filled with the scents of pine and earth, making every deep breath particularly pleasant. Once we stopped at the edge of the forest at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, we were greeted by a ranger named Thomas Hale. His snug-fitting uniform accentuated his sturdy build, and deep wrinkles around his eyes spoke of many years spent outdoors. Approaching us, Thomas respectfully shook each of our hands. We introduced ourselves and explained to him the purpose of our arrival. Our group had come here on behalf of the government to search for and neutralize the beast responsible for attacks on people in this area. Thomas listened attentively, his gaze occasionally shifting from one to another of us, as if assessing our readiness to face the task. He confirmed that he had heard about the recent incidents and expressed his concern about the safety of both the local residents and the newcomers. The ranger shared invaluable information with us about the terrain, potential trails the beast could use, and its recent recorded locations. Thomas also pointed out areas that could be particularly dangerous due to their ruggedness and other risks not directly related to our mission. I asked Thomas if he had noticed any suspicious individuals in the vicinity. He replied negatively, noting that access to the park had been restricted after a series of attacks, but he did not rule out the possibility that someone could have entered unnoticed by the authorities. We thanked him for the information provided and continued on our way. With only a few days left until the full moon, our task during this time was to locate the suspect. It was easier to catch the werewolf while it was in human form, giving us the opportunity to capture and confirm its identity before proceeding with its neutralization. The entire first day of our search was spent in tense exploration of the terrain. We carefully looked for any traces the werewolf might have left behind. Despite our diligence, the day ended without any significant findings. As dusk fell, we decided to set up camp and spend the night in tents, ready to continue the search at dawn with renewed vigor. On the second day of our search, as we made our way through dense thickets, we stumbled upon an abandoned wooden cabin. It seemed ancient, with weather-beaten walls and a sagging roof, under which lay the history of many years. The door to the house was ajar, inviting us inside. Stepping in, we found ourselves in a room where chaos reigned. Furniture was overturned, shelves were almost empty, and torn books and personal belongings littered the floor. Traces of blood created a gruesome picture on the floor and walls, adding an element of horror to the already grim atmosphere. As we inspected the wreckage, a man approached the house, dressed in worn-out clothes that once may have been sturdy and warm, but were now worn and dirty. His face was covered in a thick beard, and there was something troubled in his eyes. The man introduced himself as Marcus. Marcus greeted us with suspicion and asked what we were doing in such a remote place. In turn, we asked him about the reasons for his presence here, and whether he had noticed anything unusual lately. His answers were vague and raised more questions than answers. Everything in his behavior and the environment around indicated that he might be connected to our investigation. I glanced at Jack, then looked at John. He nodded. We surrounded him from 3 sides while Sophia couldn't understand what we were about to do. John stood opposite the suspect and said, "Excuse me, sir, but we ask for your cooperation. Could you stay with us for a while?" "What? What do you want?" "I'm not guilty, I swear. Why do you want to detain me?" Marcus replied, stepping back and stuttering. "We won't harm you. Just ask you to stay with us until midnight." The man got scared and tried to run away, but we grabbed him and tied him up. Sophia was outraged by our actions and looked at us reproachfully. We simply shrugged. We had no choice. There were only 6 hours left until midnight, and in that time we would hardly be able to find anything. And this man was extremely suspicious. We tidied up the house and moved the man inside. He continued to struggle, but soon calmed down. We brought some firewood and lit a fire in front of the house. Then we grilled some meat and fed the man. At first he refused, but the smell of food hit his nose and he gulped it all down, apparently very hungry. It was 11:45 on the clock, and we were ready. Earlier I had briefed everyone, especially explaining to Sophia what to do and how. We stood surrounding the man, tying him even tighter, and aimed our weapons loaded with tranquilizers at him. The man initially protested, but when we pointed the gun barrels at him, he visibly wilted. Then he started crying and murmuring some prayer. We exchanged awkward glances. Sophia looked disapprovingly at it all. But what could we do? It was always better to be safe than sorry. It was 11:55 on the clock. Suddenly someone began knocking on our door, which we had previously locked. "Hey, who's inside? Open up. Visiting this park is forbidden." We heard a familiar voice. It turned out to be our acquaintance, Park Ranger Thomas Hale. He persistently knocked on the door, to which I responded, loudly stating that it was us and the situation was under our control, urging him to step back. The knocking stopped for a moment. Then, through the gap in the door, which turned out to be wide enough, I noticed his eye. Thomas apparently saw the scene before him and demanded explanations about what was happening. John couldn't hold back and replied for him to mind his own business and bug off. It was 11:59 on the clock. We were incredibly tense and kept our eyes on the man. He continued to sob and hum something under his breath. Midnight struck, and the tension in the air reached its peak. Suddenly, the lantern illuminating the room began to flicker, which scared Sophia. But nothing happened. I double-checked my watch and realized we got the wrong one. Suddenly, I heard some noise in the yard. I walked to the door, opened it, and looked outside. There, with his back to us, stood our familiar ranger. His head was lowered as if he were looking for something on the ground, his shoulders trembling as if he were holding back laughter. Then he raised his head and howled. My partners also looked out and stared in shock at the scene. And then it started. The transformation. It was my first time seeing something so terrifying and disgusting. The ranger began to tremble madly and emit horrible moans of pain. His arms elongated, and before our eyes, his entire body began to be covered with fur, his clothes tearing in places, his boots splitting with a pop and flying apart in different directions, revealing huge paws with claws. The transformation ended, and the creature still stood with its back to us, breathing heavily, steam coming out of its mouth. Then it slowly turned its head towards us. Our gazes met. A horribly grotesque and frightening wolf face looked at us. I fired. The creature roared and lunged towards us. I hit it in the shoulder, but it didn't stop it. It leaped towards me, and I quickly threw myself backward and closed the door. The werewolf crashed into it and tore it off its hinges, which stopped its momentum and gave us time to open fire. A barrage of bullets flew at it. It, wounded, roared and leaped into the night. We chased after it, but saw that it had managed to disappear into the bushes. We looked around in bewilderment. Then I glanced at the man, who had become an unwitting participant in our hunt. But he had already lost consciousness from this horrible scene. We untied him and laid him on the bed in the corner. Then we packed our things and prepared to leave. Sophia was against leaving him like that, but I was sure the werewolf wouldn't come back. And the man, waking up in the morning, would think it was just a nightmare. We left and soon found ourselves at yesterday's parking spot. We didn't pursue the werewolf, as we could turn from hunters into prey. At night, with poor visibility, this creature could leap out from any bush. In the morning, we began discussing our next steps. Since the werewolf had transformed, we had 3 days to catch it. Then Sophia asked a question. If in 3 days he will transform back into a human, why don't we just wait it out? We know his identity. We'll just catch him when he's human. That's unacceptable. I shook my head negatively. You saw that the park is closed. But there was a man here. How many more people could be here? It's a big risk. There could be killings or infections. That's why the government hired us to catch the monster, not the man. Everyone looked at me as the most experienced hunter, waiting for me to decide. I proposed my version, and everyone frowned, pondering what I had said. A couple of hours later, I sat and looked through binoculars, surveying the surroundings. Jack sat next to me, checking his rifle for malfunctions. Silence reigned around us, and there were no signs of the beast's presence. My gaze slid across the open clearing in front of us, where Sophia was waiting. Next to her, a speaker was loudly playing animal sounds, and nearby a flag fluttered, catching every gust of wind. On the opposite side of the clearing, perched on a tree branch, was John, a former soldier ready to open fire at short range. I continued to survey the area when Jack interrupted me with a question. "Don't you think this is too dangerous?" he asked for the umpteenth time. "Of course it's dangerous, but she volunteered to be the bait, and it makes sense since she's the worst with weapons," I replied while still looking through the binoculars. "I understand all that, but I have a feeling that things won't go according to plan," Jack said worriedly. I just shrugged. My strategy was simple: lure the predator. Earlier in the arsenal, I found an audio device labeled for attracting prey. I had encountered similar methods before, but I was surprised by the presence of a specialized device for werewolves. I also found a vial of liquid labeled pheromones for werewolves. I had brought these items in advance, packing them into a backpack. However, it wasn't enough. We also needed a visual lure. Sharing this thought with my colleagues, we all pondered until Sophia suggested her candidacy. At first I was against it, but in the end I agreed. We dressed Sophia in an anti-dog suit found in the armory, assuming it could protect her from possible bites. Then we found a secluded clearing surrounded by trees and well visible from our observation point on the hill. In the center of the clearing, we placed columns emitting sounds intended to attract the creature, and nearby we planted a flag liberally sprayed with pheromones. Thanks to the wind, the flag fluttered actively, spreading the scent around. I glanced at my watch. It was 6. Evening was approaching, which meant it would soon be getting dark. I looked through the binoculars, but the predator was still not in sight. Jack continued the conversation. "Why did you agree to this mission?" he asked. "Well," I pondered, "probably primarily out of hunting interest. For me, it was a new challenge." "And what about you? Why did you agree?" "It's simple for the money," Jack replied and looked sadly at the forest. "After what I went through at work, I would never have agreed to this proposal in my life. But my daughter got seriously ill, and I need money for her treatment." "I understand. I think success awaits us, and everything will be fine with your daughter," I said. "I hope so," Jack replied sadly. Suddenly I caught movement with my eye. Something was descending from the mountain and running towards Sophia. Could it be our client? I took a closer look, and shivers ran down my spine. We lured the wrong one. Among the bushes and trees, a large, hairy figure was running. It was a bear. I urgently shouted into the radio, "Sophia, you need to leave immediately. A bear is approaching you. Do you hear me?" "What?" "Yes, but in this suit, I won't be able to run far. But I'll try." She panicked and replied. Jack, a former ranger, knew how to distract the bear. He ran towards Sophia. Meanwhile, I continued to survey the surroundings, and suddenly I spotted another movement. Upon closer inspection, I realized it was the werewolf this time. It was running directly towards the bear. I immediately reacted and shouted into the radio, "Alert! A werewolf is also approaching us. Be ready." "Jack, Don't get closer to Sophia. Take your position. John, be ready to open fire. Sophia, follow the previously prepared plan. I finished the message and grabbed my rifle. It was a legendary .338 Lapua Magnum, capable of hitting targets over a mile away with a large caliber. I lay down, took aim, and looked through the scope. Then I turned on the radio and continued to coordinate the team. Bear at 2 o'clock. We'll be here in about a minute. Werewolf at 10 o'clock. Looks like they're in for a pleasant meeting. Soon, the bear emerged onto the clearing, roaring as it charged towards Sophia. She continued to stand her ground, while the bear closed the distance. Suddenly, from another part of the clearing, the werewolf leaped out. It was incredibly fast, but surprisingly, it wasn't running towards Sophia but towards the bear. The bear noticed it, abruptly stopped, and ran towards the werewolf. There was a collision, and the bear tumbled backward. I was amazed. This monster was incredibly strong if it could fend off a bear. Then a fight ensued. The werewolf sank its teeth into the bear's neck, tearing at it. The bear roared in pain, trying to shake off the werewolf. However, the werewolf held on firmly, and soon the bear fell lifeless, its head dangling on a piece of skin. The werewolf, still not satisfied, continued to feed on its blood. Then it stood up, lifted its head in ecstasy, and howled. A chill ran down our spines. After that, it turned towards Sophia. I roughly estimated the werewolf's strength and realized that her flimsy costume wouldn't protect her. I shouted into the radio to open fire. Shots rang out. Some bullets hit their target, causing the werewolf to howl in pain. I took a shot and hit its leg, sending it sprawling to the side. I reloaded my rifle, but at that moment, the creature leaped up and lunged towards the trees. Jack was sitting there, having climbed a tree earlier, firing at the werewolf. Though wounded, the creature dodged actively, zigzagging as it ran. Then it jumped high, very high. I aimed and fired. I hit it, but the creature still managed to reach Jack and knock him off the tree. I didn't shoot because there was a chance I might hit Jack. I was ready to run, but then I saw Sophia running to help. Awkwardly shuffling in her costume, she headed towards Jack with her secret weapon. I calmed down and took my position again. Just as the werewolf was about to leap at Jack, who was unconscious on the ground, Sophia managed to reach him and throw a grenade. It exploded, and silver smoke engulfed the area. The werewolf became disoriented and began clawing at its face as if sneezing. It was my chance. I aimed at the creature and fired once, then again. Finally, the werewolf fell and stopped moving. I grabbed another rifle and ran. Sophia was already administering first aid to Jack, who had regained consciousness and was looking around bewilderedly. John ran to them at the same time I did. We approached the werewolf's body, which lay motionless. It was still breathing. The bullets didn't have a strong, armor-piercing effect, but they contained tranquilizers that were finally taking effect. John decided to flip the body over, and suddenly the werewolf opened its eyes and swatted at John with its hand. Luckily, he reacted in time, being a former soldier, so the blow wasn't fatal. I opened fire with the rifle. The creature convulsed and froze. I ran to John, but he had already gotten up. I breathed a sigh of relief. I pulled a syringe from my bag and filled it with an additional dose of tranquilizer. Then I injected it into the werewolf. That should do it. Then I checked on my companions. Jack had a broken arm but was otherwise okay. We exchanged relieved glances. The job was done, but shock and horror still lingered on our faces. I contacted Alex via radio, and soon people arrived to transport the werewolf's body. We received first aid as well. Back at base, we finally got a chance to rest. Lying on the bed, I reflected on the events that had just unfolded. The mission was indeed extremely risky. Suddenly, my phone pinged with a notification. The message read, $500,000 has been deposited into your account. I was surprised by how quickly the agency processed the payment. My surprise quickly turned to joy, but not for my own gain. I was happy for Jack. Now he could afford his daughter's treatment. A smile spread across my face, but then another message came in. It was from Alex. He urgently summoned us all to the living room. I instantly jumped off the bed and hurried there. In the living room, Sophia was already present, and Alex was visibly agitated, pacing back and forth. It didn't take long for the rest of us to join. Alex looked at us and, with evident regret in his voice, began to speak. I'm sorry to interrupt your well-deserved rest, but we need to urgently go to a certain place. It will be your next mission. We exchanged dismayed looks but didn't refuse the task, except for Jack, who stayed at the base due to his injury. Leaving the building, we got into the car and drove for a couple of hours until we reached the forest. Turning off the main road, we continued along a newly cut trail, with freshly felled trees still lying around. After about half an hour, we arrived at our destination, where towering pines and dense undergrowth greeted us. The area was fenced off, with an open metal hatch at its center. Alex was the first to climb down, and we followed suit. Descending, we soon saw light and found ourselves in the corridor of an underground structure. There were many people here, engaged in lively conversations and discussions. Alex led us further down the corridor. It wasn't long before we stopped in front of a door guarded by 2 security personnel. Showing his pass, Alex secured our entry. Inside, we were greeted by a spacious, well-lit laboratory. At its center stood a huge capsule, surrounded by a group of scientists in white lab coats. Asking the scientists to clear the space, Alex approached the capsule. Once the scientists dispersed, we saw a sight that shocked us. In the capsule, filled with green liquid, floated a huge, grotesque wolf's head. Its gaze seemed so realistic that it felt like it could come to life any moment and pounce on us. We stood there, unable to tear our eyes away from this monster. Alex, approaching us, began to speak with noticeable concern in his voice. Are you surprised? I was shocked too when I saw this creature. So we need to unravel its origin. And that will be your next task. I stood there stunned, unable to take my eyes off the head floating inside the glass capsule. It seemed alive. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Yet logic stopped making sense when it came to these creatures I knew nothing about until recently. The whole situation felt like a dream. A horrible, absurd dream I couldn't wake from. Sophia, burning with curiosity, moved closer and started to examine the capsule carefully. The creature's eyes gleamed in the cold light of the lab, and I felt something stir inside me. But I shook off the feeling. Instead of giving in to the growing unease, I forced myself to focus and, keeping my voice steady, asked Alex, "Explain again what we need to do." Alex nodded and began to speak. He looked calm, but his voice carried the weariness of someone long accustomed to danger. He explained that the lab once belonged to a private company, but after a major incident, it had been abandoned. A group of students had recently come here, and that's when everything went wrong. Alex gave us the details of the incident, mentioning that one of the students had been infected with something terrible. "She disappeared into the forest," he finished, his eyes flashing with cold intensity. "Your task is to find her, preferably alive, but if she becomes a threat..." He paused for a moment. "Handle it as necessary." Sophia, turning around with a glimmer in her eyes, asked, "Can I stay and study this head?" Alex nodded. "That's exactly what I was going to suggest. You'll stay here, and the others will go after the infected one." John and I exchanged glances and nodded. After gathering all the necessary equipment, we headed to the pickup truck where weapons and gear awaited us. I grabbed a shotgun and a few other tools. We had no idea what we were up against. The creature was an unknown type of werewolf. Silver bullets might be useless, just like everything else, so we took an arsenal to cover all bases. The plan was simple: follow any tracks in the forest and begin the hunt. Tall pines surrounded the entrance to the lab, their tops meeting somewhere far above, and a light breeze stirred the soft needles. The forest here wasn't dense. The undergrowth was sparse, though traces of wildlife were visible in places. We cautiously surveyed the area, listening to every sound. It was quiet, too quiet for such a large forest. John crouched down and ran his fingers across the ground, and that's when I saw it. Fresh tracks. They were human, but among them was something else. Narrow, elongated prints, with deep impressions left by claws. Beast tracks. I knelt beside him, feeling the tension in the air grow. "Looks like we're on the right track," I said quietly, and John nodded in response, his face focused, the shadows of the pines falling on him like scars. We moved forward, following the trail, keeping a steady pace. The tracks led us deeper into the forest, winding between trees as if the creature wasn't sure where it was going. We followed the trail for hours, exchanging few words. The forest seemed endless, growing more ominous with every step. Tension hung in the air, as if the woods were hiding something, breathing down our necks with a cold, invisible presence. Suddenly the tracks changed. We stopped at the same time, staring at the ground. The beast's tracks had vanished, replaced by human footprints. The werewolf had been here and shifted back into human form. The thought chilled my blood. But the moment didn't last long. After a few more steps, the prints turned beastly again, as though the monster had shifted forms once more. We kept moving, following the trail that led us deeper into the forest. Soon, the sound of running water reached our ears, and after a few minutes, we emerged by a small river. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the water, and the forest was draped in the gray twilight. "It's time to stop," I said, glancing at the setting sun. "It'll be dark soon." We set up camp by the river, gathering branches for a fire. A faint flame flickered, lighting up our weary faces. John pulled out some food and we ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest. Somewhere in the distance, night birds called out, and the water whispered quietly in the darkness. We agreed to take turns on watch. It would be incredibly foolish to leave ourselves unguarded with the creature possibly lurking nearby. I volunteered to go first, and John, barely getting into the tent, was snoring within seconds. It's a skill soldiers have, a natural ability to fall asleep instantly, knowing every minute of rest counts. I sat there, holding the tablet Alex had given me, reviewing the case once again under the dim light of the dying fire. I went through it, hoping to squeeze out any details that might help us. The werewolf, a girl named Emily, seemed completely ordinary at first glance. She was infected after cutting herself on a shard from a vial containing an unknown liquid. Neither her behavior nor the exact form of the werewolf had been fully studied, but the file emphasized that she was extremely dangerous and brutal, though she retained some remnants of her human mind. As if I didn't already know that, I thought, feeling a chill run down my spine. It was at that moment that I heard a rustling sound. The whole forest seemed to freeze. I quickly grabbed my rifle, aiming it toward the noise. My heart pounded faster and the air grew thick with tension, oppressive, almost tangible silence. as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, watching my every move. From the bushes, a hand appeared, thin, trembling. I squinted and realized it was a woman's hand. Soon a girl emerged from the foliage. She was completely naked, trying to cover herself as best as she could, clutching her arms to her chest, attempting to preserve a shred of modesty. Her eyes were filled with fear and desperation. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice so faint it sounded like she was speaking her last words. She looked as if she was barely able to stand, and there was nothing threatening in her appearance. Her body trembled, and she appeared exhausted, like a victim in desperate need of rescue. For a moment, the urge to run to her, to wrap her in my jacket and help her, flickered inside me. But I knew this could be a trap. "Stop!" I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel it waver. She looked at me, confused, as if she didn't understand why I wasn't running to her. Her eyes shone in the firelight, full of pleading. "Please help me," she whispered again, taking a step forward. "Stay where you are!" I shouted louder, raising the rifle. John burst out of the tent, instantly assessing the situation. He had his weapon ready, aimed directly at the girl, who froze in his sights. The tension in the air was about to snap like a taut string. One wrong move, and everything could change in an instant. Time stretched, like a rubber band pulled thin and tight. The girl stood before us, her expression puzzled, as if she wasn't sure what to do next. John glanced at me, waiting for my decision, ready to act at any moment. Dozens of scenarios ran through my mind, but only one seemed even remotely reasonable. I pulled a syringe filled with sedative from the pack and, looking straight into her eyes, said, "I'll help you, but I need to give you an injection." Her gaze darkened with doubt. She started to back away, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes. That moment was so brief, I almost missed it. But John didn't seem to notice anything. The girl suddenly stopped and said, "Fine, I'll let you. Just hurry." She began to move toward us slowly. John kept his aim locked on her, and I carefully approached with the syringe. Just as I was a few steps away, I saw her face twist. Her eyes lit up with a wild, sinister fire, and in an instant her features hardened. I jumped back just in time, and she lunged at the spot where I had just stood. Everything happened so fast, I barely had time to process it. The girl began to transform rapidly. I'd seen werewolves shift slowly before, but this was different. Her transformation took mere seconds. It was as if some ancient magic had been triggered in an instant. One moment there was a frightened naked girl before us, and the next, she had become a monstrous fur-covered creature. I frantically tried to recall details from the report. There had been no mention of such a fast transformation. Was she growing stronger each day, mastering her new powers? That thought flashed through my mind, but there was no time to dwell on it. John didn't hesitate. His finger acted on instinct, and shot after shot shattered the silence of the night forest. I reacted just as quickly, raising my rifle and firing off several rounds. The creature was incredibly fast, but one of my shots hit her in the leg. The air smelled of blood, but to my horror, the wound began healing right before our eyes. The silver bullets were useless. Her regeneration was terrifying. We kept firing, trying to prevent her from getting too close. She darted and weaved, circling us like a wild animal, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I realized that regular firearms wouldn't be enough, so I threw a special grenade designed for creatures like her. It slowed her down, and the beast howled in pain and fury. But even in this state, the werewolf continued to maneuver, trying to keep her distance. I could see her hesitating, weighing her chances. In the end, she decided to retreat. This was our chance. "No, you won't get away," I whispered, pulling out a handgun I had saved for this exact moment. I aimed at her back as she disappeared into the forest and fired. The bullet tore through her body and the werewolf roared, loud and furious. But instead of turning to attack, it vanished into the trees, leaving only a faint trace behind. We stood there, both of us breathing heavily, staring in the direction where the creature had disappeared. The forest was silent again, but the tension lingered. She was wounded, but far from defeated. "Are we going after her?" John asked hesitantly, still breathing heavily from the encounter. I shook my head. "We need to catch our breath and analyze her abilities. Plus, I didn't fire that last shot for nothing. The bullet had a tracking device embedded." I grabbed the tablet and launched the tracking program. A moving dot immediately appeared on the screen. Our target. She was slowly heading north. I sighed in relief, grateful the plan had worked. The GPS-based tracker was designed to stay inside her unless she somehow figured out she'd been tagged. But as long as she didn't remove it, we'd always know where she was. John gave me a questioning look. "What's our next move?" I glanced at the growing darkness and said, "Chasing her down at night would be too dangerous. We'll wait until morning, then decide our course of action." The night passed uneasily. We took turns keeping watch, each of us straining to catch any sound in the night, but to our surprise, she didn't return. She must have decided to flee further away. When morning came, we packed up and checked the coordinates again. To my dismay, I noticed she had changed direction, heading south toward the town. It was bad news. The werewolf had covered a large distance in a short time and was now moving toward an area where people might be. "Shit," John muttered, looking at the map. "We need to move fast." We quickly broke camp and headed back to the pickup. The trek back took time, and every minute felt agonizingly long. I checked the coordinates every few minutes, and each time the creature stayed on course, drawing closer to the small town. The moment we got into the truck, we sped off, wasting no time. The drive was long, but we pushed the vehicle as hard as we could, all the while anxiously watching the tracker on the tablet. The creature didn't stray from its path, still heading straight for the town. One question gnawed at me the entire time. "Where is she going?" I muttered, wondering if she had a specific destination or if it was just instinct driving her. We reached the town just before evening and managed to get ahead of her. Parking on the outskirts, we kept an eye on the forest's edge, where the werewolf had paused as if waiting for something. The area where she had stopped was right at the border between the woods and the town. Old trees stood there, casting long shadows in the fading twilight. The town was nearby, the first houses visible, but it seemed as though the forest was holding them back, like a protective barrier. We armed ourselves, checking our ammunition and equipment. Every step was filled with tension, not too fast to spook the creature, but not too slow to let her slip away. I kept checking the tablet, and the dot remained still. It was strange that she had suddenly stopped, as if she were waiting for something. As we drew closer, I spotted her through the trees. It was Emily. She was standing right at the edge of the forest, wearing a simple dress that she must have found nearby. We approached cautiously, weapons at the ready. I took a closer look at her clothes. There were no bloodstains or signs of violence. which meant she hadn't killed anyone and had simply stolen the dress. But her unnatural stillness was unnerving. Emily stood there, staring toward the town, as though something was pulling her toward it. The light was fading fast, and the forest around us sank into a gray twilight. I aimed my rifle but didn't fire. She hadn't made a threatening move yet. We got closer, and I called out, my voice strained, "Emily, we're here to help. You don't have to fight us." But she didn't seem to hear me. She didn't even turn her head. Her gaze remained fixed on the town, as if we didn't exist. Another step closer, and I called out again. "Surrender, Emily. We don't want to hurt you." Suddenly she spun around, her face twisted into a sinister snarl, her lips curling back to reveal teeth that seemed unnaturally sharp, almost predatory. Her eyes were full of contradictions, as if an inner battle raged within her. It was an expression of pain, despair, and primal rage. Human and beast colliding. I could feel that she was moments away from attacking us, and then it happened. She lunged at us. I fired reflexively, hitting her in the arm before she could fully transform. She cried out, grabbing her arm, and I saw blood gush from the wound. But something was different. This time the wound wasn't healing as quickly as before. Her scream was filled with pain, and then, in the next moment, she let out a feral roar and completed her transformation into a werewolf. Instantly, the wound on her arm healed, as if her powers had fully returned. We started firing again, but the creature was faster than we had anticipated. She snarled and slashed at us with her claws, and before we could surround her, she bolted toward the town. Her dress, somehow still clinging to her, flapped in the wind, turning her into a horrific blend of human and beast. It was a terrifying sight. An image that was hard to shake from my mind. We didn't waste time thinking. We immediately gave chase, knowing that every second counted. There could be innocent people in the town, and now that monster was heading straight for them. On the way, I got in touch with Alex, briefly explaining the situation. He listened carefully and promised to send backup, but warned that help might be delayed. We continued following the creature, which was hiding in the shadows of the streetlights. It moved along the edge of the street, skillfully dodging the light, darting from house to house, as if playing some sinister game. Suddenly I noticed on the tablet that the signal had stopped moving. We cautiously approached, straining our eyes to see in the darkness. The creature was right behind a small wooden fence, one of those that surround old houses in the suburbs. Slowly, with weapons ready, we started to circle around the fence, expecting to see the werewolf at any moment. The silence was oppressive, and each of our footsteps echoed in the air. A light breeze rustled the leaves, and in the glow of the streetlights the shadows seemed alive. John and I exchanged glances. The tension hung in the air like an invisible threat. We approached the fence and, leaning over it, peeked behind. But instead of the monster we expected to see, there was a tracker lying on the ground, covered in blood. "Damn!" I hissed, feeling a chill run down my spine. She found it. This was very bad news. The creature had figured out it was being tracked and had disposed of the device. Now we had no way of pinpointing its location. John clenched his jaw, staring angrily at the bloody stain. We began inspecting the spot where the werewolf had discarded the tracker, trying to find any traces. But in the center of town, it was incredibly difficult. Though the town was small and the streets were empty, it was nearly impossible to spot the creature's tracks. It moved quietly and invisibly, and now every house, every shadow could be hiding the threat. We made our way down the street, checking corners, fences, and alleyways, but everything was clear. It seemed as if she had vanished into thin air. "This place is a maze," John said, looking around. "She could be anywhere." The town's population was small, and there wasn't a soul on the streets, which worked to our advantage. At least there were no additional casualties. But the feeling that we were losing her trail grew stronger by the minute. We kept searching, moving slowly and methodically, checking every nook and cranny, but there was nothing. No tracks, no sign of the werewolf's presence. I stopped and thought for a moment, trying to piece everything together. There had to be a reason she headed for this town. I opened the tablet, looking through Emily's file, and then it hit me. Of course, this was her hometown. She was returning home. I quickly found her address in the files and told John, "It's her house. She's probably headed there." We immediately got into the pickup truck and drove to the address. The drive took some time, but now everything made sense. We knew where we were going. As we traveled, I thought about the werewolf returning to a place that might still hold pieces of her old life. Maybe she hoped to hide, or to become the person she once was. But that was a dangerous path. When we arrived at the house, dusk had already consumed the town. It was a small, modest two-story home. The paint on the shutters was cracked, and old, overgrown bushes lined the front yard. The house looked quiet, but something about it stirred a vague sense of unease. We got out of the truck, glancing around. First, we walked around the house, checking every corner, but everything appeared calm. Near one of the walls, we noticed a gate that was slightly ajar, but there were no signs or footprints indicating someone had been there recently. Suddenly, I spotted an open window on the second floor. The bedroom window. This could mean she was already inside. "There's an open window," I said, nodding toward the second floor. We quickly headed to the front door and knocked. An elderly man opened it with his wife standing a little behind him. Both of them looked tired and worn, as if they had recently gone through something tragic. Their eyes showed surprise, but when they saw us armed, a shadow of fear passed over their faces. "We're with security. There might be a dangerous individual in your house. You need to step outside," I said, trying to speak calmly but with authority. The man frowned, not believing his ears. "What? What are you talking about? Someone's a criminal?" His voice was full of skepticism, but I noticed he started to get nervous. I stepped closer and, without giving him much time to think, said, "You can call the police if you want, but we don't have much time. We're here on urgent business. Your safety is the priority." Looking at his wife, who was clearly starting to panic, the man reluctantly sighed but complied. Giving in to our pressure, they stepped outside, leaving us to search the house. Once they were out, I closed the door behind them, and with my weapon ready, nodded to John. We moved carefully through the house, each step deliberate, as if any wrong move might give us away. The air was thick with tension, the silence so deep, it felt like you could hear your own heartbeat. We crossed the living room, heading toward the staircase that led to the second floor. It stood in the corner, half hidden in the shadows, and despite its age, it looked sturdy, though each creak echoed in the stillness. John and I started ascending the stairs, trying to remain as quiet as possible. We both kept our weapons ready, knowing that any moment could be our last. The staircase stretched upward, as if it knew something horrible awaited us at the top. Step by step, we reached the second floor. The hallway was narrow with wooden floors that creaked softly under our feet. Doors lined both sides, but one at the far end seemed especially important. It was clearly the bedroom. I nodded to John, and we headed toward it, our footsteps barely audible. When we reached the door, I grasped the handle and, trying not to make a sound, slowly pushed it open. The door creaked slightly, and I held my breath as I peeked inside. In the dim light filtering through the window, something stood in the middle of the room. The werewolf, still wearing the dress we had seen her in earlier. It was a terrifying sight. The dress somehow had remained on her like a remnant of her former human life. But now she was a massive, fur-covered beast with a distorted, animalistic face. She stood upright, as if waiting for something, her breathing heavy, almost audible in the quiet. I gritted my teeth, knowing we had no other choice. I signaled to John, and we both opened fire at the same time. The loud gunshots shattered the silence, muzzle flashes lighting up the room. The werewolf roared, and before I could process what was happening, she lunged at me. The sheer force knocked me off my feet. I flew backward, slamming into the wall. Gasping for air, I looked up and saw the creature preparing for another leap. But John reacted faster than she expected. His well-aimed shot hit her right in the eye. The werewolf howled, trembling as if struck by an invisible force. It gave me a chance to get back on my feet, my heart racing wildly. The beast writhed on the floor, but right before our eyes, the wound began to heal. The silver, just like before, wasn't working. She was regenerating despite everything. "Damn it, she's healing," I said, realizing the gravity of the situation. The werewolf sprang to her feet, and within seconds, she lunged at us again. I knew we had to retreat. We began backing up, continuing to fire, trying to slow the creature down, but her advance was relentless. Each step we took backward brought us closer to the stairs, and finally, we all but tumbled down to the first floor. The werewolf, like a shadow, pursued us, her claws pounding against the floor, the threat palpable in the air. We burst out onto the street, still firing at the creature, but it didn't retreat. Suddenly, a woman's scream pierced the darkness. I noticed the beast paused for a moment, as if that sound had drawn its attention. The werewolf howled, throwing its head back toward the sky, its cry filled with a strange, primal despair. And before we could react, the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest, leaving us standing in the middle of the street, engulfed in sudden silence. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from my body. The realization that we had gotten lucky once again began to sink in. This creature, the werewolf, seemed to be battling itself, unwilling to fully give in to its instincts and kill us. If it had, we'd be nothing but corpses. And the most terrifying part, it was almost invulnerable, regenerating right before our eyes. The situation was at a stalemate. Several ideas spun in my head. Either take her head off with a high-caliber weapon, or try to kill her while she was still in her human form. I remembered the moment when my shot had hurt her earlier and realized that she had been vulnerable then. Damn it, I cursed to myself. Facing a lycanthrope had been far easier compared to this nightmare. Suddenly, the sound of sirens broke the silence. We turned to see about a dozen pickup trucks pulling up. They had no markings, but I immediately knew. It was the backup Alex had sent. One of the men got out, spotted us, and walked over. "I'm here to help. Alex said the situation was serious," he introduced himself. We quickly explained what had happened, describing the creature's regeneration, its invulnerability, and the internal struggle it seemed to be fighting against its instincts. After that, the operation kicked into gear. The town was divided into sectors, and the search began. But even with reinforcements, the situation remained critical. I couldn't shake the thought of how we could stop this creature. While scrolling through Emily's file on the tablet, I came across the name of a witness I hadn't noticed before. His name was David, and he lived just a few blocks from here. It was the only lead we had left. I decided we needed to check out his house. As we drove through the deserted streets, the sky darkened with heavy clouds, and soon the rain began to fall. When we arrived at David's house, the rain was pouring down in sheets, obliterating any visibility. Water streamed down the windows of the pickup, making everything outside look blurry and distorted. In the glow of the headlights, a modest but well-kept two-story house came into view. The light from the first-floor kitchen illuminated the inside, where a young man, likely David, was cooking, oblivious to what was happening outside. I stopped the truck and John and I stepped out, immediately drenched by the downpour. As I scanned the area, my eyes locked on a figure standing motionless in the rain near the window. It was a girl, wearing the same dress we had seen her in earlier, staring into the house. My attention was drawn to what was happening in the kitchen. David was calmly preparing a meal, unaware of the danger looming just outside. I quietly loaded the tranquilizer gun and gestured to John to take his position. We began to flank the girl, moving silently under the cover of the rain. She seemed completely unaware of us, her focus entirely on what was happening inside the house. But my instincts told me that she knew we were there. Just as I took aim and fired, everything happened in a flash. She dodged with inhuman speed, her body beginning to transform rapidly. A deep roar echoed, a low, raspy sound, as if something ancient and wild had been unleashed. The werewolf leapt at us with fury, and we opened fire, knowing our chance to hit her in human form was gone. The tranquilizer rounds struck her but had no effect. She was moving too fast. Remembering a tool from our arsenal, I quickly pulled out a sonic bomb designed to stun werewolves. I threw it, and a second later, it detonated. John and I heard nothing but a faint hiss, but a bright flash erupted before us. The werewolf shrieked. She clearly felt the impact, freezing in place as if stunned. We had a few precious seconds. I grabbed the high-caliber rifle, specially designed for situations like this, and aimed for her head, ready to end it. But suddenly a shout cut through the noise of the rain. "Emily!" It was David, the young man from the house. The werewolf seemed to react to his voice. In the moment I was about to pull the trigger, her body began to change again. She trembled, and in seconds she was a girl once more. Emily, sitting on the ground, trembling and crying under the rain. David ran to her, wrapping his arms around her, ignoring my desperate shout, "Don't go near her! Get back!" But he didn't stop. It seemed his love or desperation had overcome his fear. He held her tightly, and I froze, realizing I couldn't take the shot. Minutes later, reinforcements arrived. We sedated Emily, and she slowly calmed down, drifting into a deep sleep. She was gently placed on a stretcher and transported away. David refused to leave her side and insisted on going with her. Exhausted and drained, we finally returned to our base, knowing that this case was far more complex than we could have anticipated. The creature we had faced wasn't just a beast. There was still a part of her that was human. When we got back to the office, Jack was already there, recovering from a previous mission. We took hot showers, washing away the fatigue and adrenaline, and gathered in the common room for dinner. Jack, looking better, was glad to see us and immediately asked what had happened. We recounted our encounter with the werewolf in detail, leaving nothing out. In the middle of the conversation, I heard a notification on my phone. Checking it, I saw that another payment had been transferred, a relief as the job had been recognized. but the thoughts of what we had experienced lingered. I realized my life would never be the same. Each new mission was pulling me deeper into a dark world where monsters were real. The next morning, Alex arrived. We gave him a full report of what had happened, and he told us that Emily was now in a special lab being studied. Sophia was also there, but she was due back soon. Her absence had lasted a week, and we used that time to rest. But it was clear that our ordeal was far from over. We remained on base, as if awaiting the next mission, feeling like we were being prepared for something bigger. I thought back to the enormous head in the capsule we had seen at the lab and realized that there was still much work to be done. We had only scratched the surface of something far more significant. When Sophia finally returned, she looked worn out, but her eyes sparkled with excitement. We poured her some coffee, and after catching her breath, she began telling us about her findings. "I've catalogued all the cases related to werewolves," she started. "This last one with Emily is unique. She can shift instantly and, more importantly, retain control over her mind. This is something new, you understand. I've studied your case and others that have happened before, and I've discovered that they all share one common link. Everything points to that head we saw in the lab. It's not just a creature. It's something like the mother of wolves. It could have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe longer. I can't say for sure, but I'm convinced that all werewolves originate from it." We sat in silence, absorbing her words when Alex walked into the room. He had overheard Sophia's last statement and nodded. "You're right," he said. "You need to trace its origin. That's why I'm sending you on your next mission." The new assignment was just beginning, and I felt a chill of anticipation.